housekeeping items. First of all, you should have received from me an acknowledgement that I got your assignment. If you did not get that email from me, it's either because you didn't send it to me or you sent it to me after I left to come up for class. Or it's possible that if you did send me your assignment, it got caught in spam somehow, which is why I do this whole acknowledgement thing. So if you did not get it, an acknowledgement from me, and you sent it, come double check with me after class, or during the break is fine too, and we will see what we can figure out. Okay, with regard to the assignment, I was a little surprised that there weren't more questions, but that's okay. If you don't have questions, you don't have questions. Maybe my explanation was just that fantastic that you didn't have questions. I'll shoot for that, but I'm not going to assume that. I say that only as a reminder. I will be distributing assignment 2 on statutes at the end of class. Again, don't hesitate to ask those questions if they come up. And if I start getting questions that it sounds like applicable to everybody, I will email and put the questions up here on the course homepage. You see there's now a section for assignment questions. So that's it on the assignments, unless anybody has further questions. Oh, one other thing on the assignment. I will do my best to get it, assignment 1, back to you with all my comments to you next week. If all goes well, Thursday, possibly even a little bit sooner, so that way as you're doing assignment 2, you can see where, if you had any questions or if there were anything that might help you from assignment 1 with my comments. Okay, that I think truly is it on the assignments. Other housekeeping on the exam. Thank you for getting me your schedules. We will, based on your schedules, we will have the exam your choice of Monday the 7th or Tuesday the 8th. I think those are the right dates. Yes. I know some of you wanted it the week before, but it just didn't work out with everybody's exam schedule, so I made it as early as I could in consideration of everybody's schedule. So what that will mean is you will pick it up in the morning of that day and hand it in by 5 p.m. of the same day. The choice is up to you. I know a couple of you have exams on that Monday, possibly, so obviously you'll have to take it on the Tuesday. I will go into far more detail on how it all works and what's on the exam and suggestions on how to study when we talk about the exam in April. And I have posted those dates on our final exam section here on the course website. If you have any questions about it, feel free to ask now or whenever. But as I said, all of the details I will go over with ample time for questions at that time as well. Okay. If there aren't further questions, let's move on. So we talked about federal statutes, and we talked about applying the force and codification, and how the annotated code is our best friend for research. As I was looking over everybody's answers to the questions to the screencast, now of course that was before class and we went into more detail, I noticed a couple of places where a number of people were confused. I also looked at your questions that, for those of you who entered afterwards, so I'm going to try to go over those questions as we go through class today. If you're still confused about something, please ask. So by way of review, which will launch us into today's topic, which is state statutes. And that is, we start with our hero, the session law, again, enacted by the legislature, signed by the executive. If you don't mind, it's a little warm in here. And that, again, in session laws is arranged chronologically, so you have the session laws going back to the beginning of the country or the state, depending on where you're in, and so you can have a lot of statutes that are no longer in force. The force of codification comes in, we apply the force in my Star Wars analogy, and not only do we have our statute sections or code sections arranged by subject. So if we're doing research on a particular subject, hopefully they are all in that subject area, but it's those statutes that are currently in force. So anything that got superseded or reversed or expired, that's no longer going to be in the code. So the beauty of the code is that that does those two things. Okay, so in reading our chart here, our session law, our hero, is known as what in the federal world? Public law. And we find the public law on what planets? Statutes, or I should say SET, statutes at large, or USCAN. And not even going to ask you what that stands for. Okay, and the beauty of codification happens, and we find our federal statutes codified, so in subject arrangement and those currently in force, and that's in what publication? US, well, that's one of the places, that's one of the annotated codes, so that's one of the very, very best friends for us for research, but the official publication is the US code. Okay, so are we all comfortable with that? Does that all make sense? If it doesn't make sense, raise your hand and tell me what's confusing. If it does make sense, then you all now should be able to figure out, if you don't already know, what the equivalent is for state statutes. Specifically, we will look at New York, with honorable mention to Louisiana. Come on in and grab a handout. So, what is our session law called in New York? A chapter law. Don't ask me why New York calls it chapter laws, but New York calls it chapter laws. Everybody see that on the chart. Chapter law. Okay, and we'll talk about what McKinney session laws means in a moment. They are actually called acts in Louisiana. Alex, if you're interested, I looked that up earlier today. We're going to talk about municipal law later on in the semester, but we will be coming back to this chart and explaining it then. Okay, so the force gets applied and codification happens to our chapter laws in New York, and they wind up in what publication? McKinney's Black Volumes, and I will be explaining that shortly as well. Another place you will find the code for New York is the Consolidated Law Service known as CLS. In New York, interestingly, we don't have an official state publication. Both McKinney's and CLS are published by commercial publishers. Most New York attorneys use McKinney's, I think, out of habit, but CLS is just as good. Okay. So one final review item with regard to Westlaw is making me sign in again for the umpteenth time. And the beauty of codification, as we will see in New York McKinney's, but as we've already seen in the USCA, is that we are in a subject arrangement. And by that, another way of thinking about that, and actually a more official term, if you will, is we are looking at a statutory scheme. And by that statutory scheme, we have our favorite section, 1144 of the U.S. Code Annotated, Title 29. And so within that statutory scheme, it's basically the subject area where we find our particular section. So the statutory scheme for Section 1144 is within the Labor Code, and more specifically within the chapter that covers employee retirement income security. And then it gets even more detailed because it's a fairly complex piece of legislation. So it's within the subtitle of regulatory provisions within the subchapter, but the overall statutory scheme has to do with the overall subject. So I wanted to make sure you understood that particular lingo because you'll be running across it. Okay, so let's get to know state statutes, and by getting to know state statutes, we'll focus on New York, but it works the same in Louisiana as it does in most other states. Basically, the names have been changed just because that's how states like to do it. Okay, so if we want to find what are the state statutes for our client that might be applicable? Where would be a good place to start?
New York juror.
New York juror. What makes you say New York juror?
Secondary source specific to New York.
Secondary source. Now there is not a juror specific to Louisiana. Juror, by juror I mean jurisprudence. There's actually a Florida jurisprudence and a Texas jurisprudence. Louisiana does not have one. There's Louisiana Civil Practice Treatise, which may help, and there are probably other treatises as well in Louisiana. But here in New York, the rest of you are fortunate that you have New York juror. And as I've mentioned more than once before, that is where I send attorneys when they need to get a start in an area they are not familiar with. So there's New York juror, and I'm going to do our favorite search. I-L-L-T-H-M-O. Bless you. Thank you. And in doing our search, you'll see I've got section 115 highlighted because I've looked at it before, and as you also might remember, our New York juror group, who is on this side of the room, I think this is the section that you all found back in the beginning of the semester when we were looking at secondary sources. And by taking a look at New York juror, we find out, sure enough, provision of health services by a health maintenance organization. That's what section 115 is about. Not be considered the practice of law. However, each member, employer, or agent of the organization may be fully personally liable. This sounds good for our client. Accountable, negligent, wrongful misconduct comment by him under direct supervision. And there's a footnote. And of course, there it goes on to explain more with observations. It talks a little bit about ERISA. So sure enough, New York juror is going to be useful, but that ever useful footnote is directing us, as secondary sources so frequently do, to relevant primary source in the relevant statute. So let's take a look at Public Health Law, Section 4410. And it's pretty much what we have already seen with regard to annotated codes. So we will see our table of contents, always useful to take a look at, to see if there are any other useful sections. So in scrolling up, I might decide, oh look, 4406 talks about health maintenance organizations, regulation of contracts. Don't know if that's useful or not, but looking at the table of contents definitely pointed me to something I need to check out. May or may not be good. And again, our statutory scheme within the public health law of McKinney's, and again, we'll talk about McKinney's in just a moment. 4410, health professional services within Article 44. In fact, all of Article 44, our statutory scheme, is about health maintenance organizations. So this is another way of looking at the table of contents. You can go here to this link or here, whichever works better for you. And of course, we're within the public health law of McKinney's, of the New York statutes. Okay. And within our annotated code, being our friend, of course, we can get more context and analysis. So go to other secondary sources by looking at the context and analysis tab here. And of course, we can look at those ever useful notes of decisions, cases that interpret our particular section. And the very similar and slightly confusing, because it is so similar, citing references. So notes of decisions give us the cases that interpret our section. So they talk somewhat, these cases will talk somewhat more in depth about our section 4410, and we get these nice topics of the cases. Now there aren't so many under 4410, but you may remember last week there were quite a number under our U.S. Code Annotated section 1144. So you'd want that topic because you wouldn't want to look at the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases. Looking at, looks like there may be 6 of them, isn't so bad. So that's notes of decisions. Again, cases that actually interpret our section with the topics that they discuss. Citing references, slightly different. Citing references tell you where your section was cited. So not just cases, although it does tell us cases, but it also tells us other types of documents, of resources as well. So you can use this to see what cases say about 4410, but these may be cases that just mention 4410 without any discussion. Or they might discuss 4410. So I always recommend, if you're looking for cases that interpret your section, go to notes of decisions first. The advantage is to citing references, or if you do go to cases, you can then limit by jurisdiction, which is more difficult to do. It's not more difficult. You can't really do it very well in notes of decisions, which doesn't, if you think about it, we're already in New York, so it's most likely only going to be New York cases. Maybe there are 5 federal cases, but the nice thing here, in New York at least, we've got different departments. So if you really want to see what your department or any particular department has to say about a particular statute section, you would do it in citing references. Any questions about our annotated code for New York on Westlaw? So let's actually take a look at the print. Again, most likely you will find yourself practicing somewhere that has access, hopefully, to either Lexis or Westlaw, but maybe not. Or perhaps you will, Alex, you will need to look at New York statutes, and maybe your organization doesn't have access online, and you may wind up finding a library and looking at statutes in print, as the rest of you may do for other states. And it works pretty much the same way. As I say, they change around the names a little bit. So one of the ways that states change around the names a little bit, in looking at page 1 of our walkthrough. Everybody have one? You can pass it around again if you don't. Okay. One way different states organize their statutes, and you will all discover this. We will be doing a workshop on state statutes in print down in the library in a little while, is that some states, like New York, name their codes. So as you can see, we are looking at the public health law. Remember, McKinney's, not McKinney's, the U.S. Code Annotated numbers their titles. So we were looking at the labor title, but that title was 29, and we keep on referring to our section as 29 USCA 1144. Well, that's the labor title, but it's given a number. So some states go by numbers, and some states have all sorts of funky different numbering systems. Here in New York, we name our codes. As some of you will discover when we go down a little bit later, California is another state that names their codes. Connecticut, I happen to know because I used to practice there, is a state that numbers their codes the way they do in the federal system. It's not a huge deal, but just when all of a sudden you see these crazy numbers for state codes, that's why. Okay, so in looking at the print code, should you need to, the first thing you want to notice, we are talking about McKinney's. As I said, McKinney's is published by commercial publisher West, our now Thomson Reuters, our friends who do Westlaw. And what most attorneys look for when they're looking for McKinney's are basically the code. So they're looking, if they are using print, not going online, when people are asking for McKinney's, they're asking for the code because they want to find out what the law is today in its subject to range, like we've been talking about now. And they're basically looking for the black volumes. And that's why I put that on our sources handout, because essentially they want to go to the shelf and they want to find, here's McKinney's code and here's the public health law. And I will now I won't pass this around quite yet. Why, you may be wondering, am I making a big deal about color? That is because a lot of people, amazingly attorneys, get confused and they go to this volume. Now, I know you can't see it from where you are at the moment, but I'll pass these around and you will be able to. Is this red volume says on the spine McKinney's. So imagine it's sitting on a shelf, and you've got here, and they're looking for McKinney's, so they go to the volume that says McKinney's. This black one sitting on the shelf, it does not say McKinney's anywhere on the spine. So they go looking in the red volume and get themselves very confused because this is not the code. These are the session laws. These are the laws as passed by the New York legislature, signed by the governor in chronological order, and a moment I'm holding volume from 1996. So don't get confused if you wind up finding you need to look at McKinney's in print for whatever reason. You want to make sure to get the code, the consolidated laws. They are still in black. I'll pass these around so you can see why color can actually make a difference in legal research. And what it looks like, the black volume of McKinney's on the inside is on page 1. That's the title page, obviously. So we've got the public health laws. We already learned we're from New York Juror. We're interested in public health law 4410, possibly 4406. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Turning to page 2, of the walkthrough, we are looking at the statutory scheme, what I like to call the table of contents. For Article 44 about health maintenance organizations, under which the section we have already identified, courtesy of New York Juror, is 4410, Health Maintenance Organizations Professional Services. So again, if you're looking in print, you want to flip back to the table of contents to where you see the listing of the statutory scheme to see what other sections might be of interest. Same strategy applies, just different format. So you see 4406 might be interesting. Turning the page to page 3 of our walkthrough. Again, if you turned immediately to 4410, if you looked on the top right, you would say, oh, this is Article 44. So that would tell you where to flip back to get back to the statutory scheme table of contents. And 4410, there's our section. And of course, as we've said before, but worth saying again, you must read the actual statute section. Don't count on New York Juror or anybody else to tell you what it says. As lawyers, you must read it. Going to page 4, we see the end of section 4410. And what we see are the, what I call the parenthetical, also known as credits on Westlaw. And as we will see in just a little while, history on Lexis. So, everybody, this is telling me what exactly?
First passed in 1976.
Okay, by?
Law 938.
By Chapter Law 938. Is everybody following this? You're all relying on Matt here to do the yeoman's work here? Okay, and then it tells us, without our even having to translate, that it was amended by, anybody else?
1993.
By,
Chapter Law 538.
okay, Section 6. And then everybody, what does the semicolon mean? Everybody?
Again.
And amended by? What?
Chapter Law 705,
Section 5. Okay. And when you look on page 4 of our walkthrough, you see the exact same information. The only thing you don't see is the word credits. All you see is the parentheses, which is why I call it the parenthetical after the text of the section. If you have a better name for it, please give me an idea, because I haven't come up with one. Okay, so again, we see the same thing. We see historical and statutory notes. We'll be talking about that in next class, actually. And then we see secondary sources. Our friend, the annotated code, exists in print as well as online. So we see articles, law review, and journal commentaries. Again, that's the Context and Analysis tab here on Westlaw, and the research references on Lexis, which I'll show you momentarily, or a little while. Turning the page, more research references. And then we get to those wonderful notes of decisions. Again, same thing online and in print. So we see the different topics. They give the topics numbers. So if I decide, if it's really long, I decide I'm really interested in defenses. Want to see what the other side might be arguing. I'll go to topic number 5 and take a look at defenses and see what case is summarized, and then go to that case. So pretty much the same thing. This is kind of like a review of what we did last week. Hopefully you're like, all right, already, I get it. That would be good. Are we finished? I see someone tentatively, so you're not going to escape it. We have to update, update, update. One of these days you'll figure out, let me just say it so she doesn't do that. But you haven't yet, so okay. We need to check the pocket part. That's why I'm screaming like that. If you're in print. So, somewhere along our black volume is there, and we have the, I think this is only in legal publishing, a legal publishing invention of our part in the pocket, hence pocket part. And you'll note a stamp, and you've probably maybe noticed these on these walkthroughs that we've now done a couple of times. The library stamps things when they get in, and we stamp it with a date. That's usually kind of a good hint of how old it is, but it's not definitive. And it's not definitive because sometimes we have to replace things in the library because they get lost. And you can imagine these pocket parts could get lost pretty easily. They're pretty flimsy. So if we have to order another pocket part, we're going to stamp it the day it comes in, even if it is 6 months old, 2 years old, whatever. So as I said, you can kind of guess, but don't depend on that. So we can kind of guess that January 19th, 2018 is probably how old it is because that's pretty recent, right? So again, that concept of bibliographic awareness coming in yet again. So turning the page, on page 8, we see 4410, and again, we don't see anything after it, any text after it. What we see are just the research references. And we see some New York JAR, our malpractice section 115, and we see something called New York pattern jury instructions, breach of fiduciary duty. We'll be talking about PJI a little bit later because it's one of those, it does a couple of things, but it's actually a lot of lawyers, a lot of New York attorneys use it as a quick and dirty secondary source, which is fine. Anyway, turning the page to page 9, what I've done is kind of flip back a little to section 406. And the reason I did that is to show you what a print pocket part would look like if there actually was a change from the main volume. So 44.6 in this volume has been changed by the pocket part. And we know that because in looking at the pocket part, we actually see text rather than just research references and notes of decisions. And because we looked and our pocket part is stamped January 2019, we can guess it's fairly up to date. We don't know exactly how much up to date. That is in contrast, I promised to tell you about CLS, that is in contrast with CLS, Consolidated Law Service, now published by Lexis. So we have a bipolar world again. We have West or Thomson Reuters publishing McKinney's. We've got Lexis publishing CLS, which is what we'll be looking at when we look at Lexis in just a moment. Does the same thing, has the text of the statutes, has research references, has notes of decisions, may or may not have a pocket part. If it doesn't have a pocket part and you think something should be updated, that's a good clue that you need to check after either the volume or the entire set for a softbound volume. Because as you can imagine, there's been so much update to this volume that this doesn't really fit in there anymore. So they just publish it separately. So that's hint number 1, that you want to look for a softbound volume afterwards. So you can't all see this, so you'll have to take my word for it. This is stamped March 2017. Again, not dispositive, but it's a good guess that that's about, it's not quite a year old. What statute sets do, and this is what lawyers used to have to rely on, so be very glad that you were born when you were. What those of us who've been around quite a bit longer used to have to do is, after we checked the pocket part of the softbound supplement, we then had to go again to the end of the set to see if there was an interim service or interim update service. So here's an update to the update. Talk about update. I could really get carried away, but I won't. So what this does, it's dated December, so this is stamped March 2017, this is actually dated December 2017. As I said, this is updating the update. So I would check first in here, and then in here for 4410 or 4406 or whatever section I want to get as up to date in print as I can get.
How often do they come out?
The updates to the updates?
No, like McKinney.
Well, the pocket parts come out every year. And then what happens is you get what I'm calling the updates to the updates. The interim update is the official term. I like mine better. But anyway, yes.
Do they have like a valid through date or current through date? Like everything passed up until this point is in here or codified up until this point is in here?
Well, they refer you, yes, they refer you to chapters. So supplementing statutes affected by chapters 504 through 519 of the 2016 session, and by chapters 1 through 42 and 50 through 59 of the 2017 session. So that's how they do that. All good questions? I shall pass these around if you want to see updates to updates and updating. While you take a look at that, so remember, you are lucky and you are in the online world. So we basically don't see any indication of any updating. We don't even see any flags. We can take a look at how current Westlaw is. Down here, current through Chapter 1 of Laws of 2018. What I'm going to do to give you what you might want to look for is, it's hopefully still there since last time I checked. In the other section, we were looking at 44.6. What you see is a yellow flag. And as we talked about with the U.S. Code annotated last time, yellow flag's just telling us there's some proposed legislation. So a bill has been introduced in the legislature, and we'll talk all about what happens to bills next week, but a bill has been introduced in the New York legislature that may change this, or it may not. Most bills that get introduced, they die somewhere along the process, and again, we'll talk about that next week. So not really anything we have to worry about in terms of the status of the law as it exists. Good to know about if we practice in this area, or we think, we've read something that we think it's likely it might change. You would see a red flag if for whatever reason there was a change that Westlaw hadn't incorporated yet. Now you think, oh, red flag, that's pretty obvious. That's a good thing. And you would have a similarly obvious signal on Lexis. My point is just look for that. It's really easy, right? If it's a red flag, I better check it. That's all you need to know. But sometimes, and some people find one system or the other to be a little confusing, you just, again, this is just bibliographic awareness. You just want to be aware, okay, no red flag, I'm good, easy. But if there is one, don't ignore it. Okay, hopefully I have belabored that too much. Good. All right then, any questions? So let's go back to look at our walkthrough. Now we have been doing keyword searches. It may be that you either more likely need to, or you possibly could choose to look at a print index. As I've mentioned, sometimes doing keyword searching can be misleading, confusing, because the terminology in statutes is so specialized, that controlled vocabulary I told you about, or your words are just coming up with totally irrelevant results. Sometimes an index actually can help you get around that problem, whether you use it in print or online. As I said, I'm not a huge fan of it online, but if it works for you, that's fine. So here's what the index looks like in print and on the page, and here's what it looks like in the book. So if we were looking under health maintenance organizations, what I might do if my keyword searching was not working is I might just scan down. Yes, I could look under liability as we've been doing. I might look under claims as our handy dandy arrow there suggests. I would definitely look for definitions because, as I mentioned, we're talking about a statute, so if there is a statutory definition, words are key to what we do as lawyers. I want to see how my terms are statutorily defined. So I'll pass this around. So as I said, I would probably I would check for the terms that I guess might be used, and then I would scan down. And even just scanning through an index wouldn't take you that long. But we find claims, and then underneath claims we find denial pre-authorization, my handy-dandy arrows, and then INS 3238. Anybody have a guess what that means?
Insurance, section 3238.
Okay, so that one's fairly easy to guess. Looking up our other handy-dandy arrow on the right-hand side, we've got those definitions. Pub He 4401. Anybody guess what Pub He means? Public health law. Well, we kind of had a hint for that because we've been looking at the public health law for most of the class. If for whatever reason you couldn't guess what those abbreviations mean, the handy-dandy index that Tessa now has in the beginning has abbreviations of law references. Basically, any book that gives you abbreviations should have a table telling you what those abbreviations are. So if you look in the beginning of the index, you will see a listing of all of the codes within New York, within McKinney's, and their abbreviations. And turning to page 12, if you hadn't already figured it out, you would see Pub He means public health. And I mean, looking at some of these, they're could be kind of hard to figure out, like RW and BL. There was no way I would even remember that that means racing, parimutuel, wagering, and breeding law. I would need to go to the abbreviations table to decipher that. Okay, the other thing you want to think about when using an index, if you decide to do so, is some tips. So as we said, we want to scan down and maybe get some ideas of terms to look under after we've looked under the ones we've thought of. Whatever terms you're looking at, be flexible in terms of, for instance, the order you look at. So I already pulled out that this was the Health Maintenance Organization listing. It might be that I have to look under HMO. I don't know which the index is going to use. Maybe I need to look at denial and then claim rather than the order that's here, claim and denial. Maybe I need to look under liability. Maybe I want to switch around the order of all of those. So be very flexible in both using different terms. So, again, English language has lots of ways of saying the same thing, cat, feline, and then switch around the order of the terms that you use. As when you all go down to do our statutes exercise in a little while, each of the different states that we'll be looking at are going to have different orders of the terms and use different terms, so you're going to have to be flexible. Any questions about indexes?
I'm sorry if you said this before, but the easiest way to access the index on Westlaw?
I didn't say it before. The easiest way to access, if we go to McKinney's, just the overall McKinney's, on the right you will see Statutes Index. You will also see, and this was a question someone asked in the screencast, this is also where you will see historical statutes. So if for whatever reason you need to find out what the New York statute was from 2010, this is where you would go for that. Okay, let's move over to, another question.
Is there a reason why this is published by Alexis?
Free enterprise. We live in a capitalist system. So I honestly don't know the entire history of the New York statutes, but basically, long time ago, someone named McKinney decided probably he could make some money publishing the New York statutes, and his name was McKinney, so he put it on there, and then someone else decided, oh, he's making money, I can do it better, so published CLS, and they eventually, these companies got bought out by the bigger companies, as happens in our system. So now, at the moment, West owns McKinney's, and they have for quite some time, and Lexis owns the company that used to publish CLS.
There's no New York equivalent of like Congress.gov where you can go and search what they've done.
We'll get there. There is the New York statutes put out by the New York State government online. There is actually no equivalent of New York published statutes in print, in a print format, I should say. Or I should say the New York Code.
Right, one for free. For like
Online it is, not in print. Question?
So those two are the only places you find.
Other than the online, well, let me show you rather than keep you in suspense, but we'll come back here. So that's going to be here. And this is where you would find the New York Code online for free. And if you Google New York statutes, it should pull this up. And I'll talk about other ways of finding this when we get to the web portion of our discussion. Other questions? Let's take a quick look at Lexis. So on Lexis, if we were to search liability HMO, and then on Lexis, if we narrow, now of course you can do pre-filter searches and narrow, but I'm doing the post-search filters to narrow to statutes and legislation. Why didn't that? And what you need to know on Lexis is Lexis organizes its statutes a little bit differently. So if you want to go to your very best friend, your BFF, the annotated code, you need to click on codes. And then we can narrow and get to New York. And yes, you can choose New York in advance, which might be a good idea, but I wanted to make sure to show you that you needed also to narrow to codes. And so it's doing our liability HMO search. We're finding sections all over the code in the general municipal code, in, what is this, the employee LIAB code, the LLC code. So not getting to what we know is at least worth checking. Let's, however, try our terms and connectors search that we have been using. So LIAB exclamation within the same paragraph as, I'm going to make sure I get what we need in here, HMO for, whoops, health maintenance organization. And search. Okay, and again, narrow as we talked about, so we want to go to codes, and then we'll do it one more time for New York. There we go. Lexis is taking its time. And this is perhaps a more drawn-out example than is really warranted, but just to show you that natural language isn't always the best. Here's an example where our terms and connectors search, our Boolean searching, brought up a more relevant section to the top, whereas our natural language really didn't. So again, I'm not telling you don't use natural language. I always start with natural language. But if I'm not getting anything good, I think, well, maybe let me try terms and connectors because maybe I need to be a little more specific. So other than that, again, pretty much the same on Lexis. It just looks a little different and organized a little different. We have our table of contents that we can pop out and see our statutory scheme, see the different sections that might be interesting, and discover 4406 if that is indeed worth looking at. We can also look up top here to see the statutory scheme and see that Article 44 is health maintenance. In terms of organization, we can get to our notes of decisions, our research references, and of course our history, known as credits on Westlaw, with that same information. So the annotated code part of Lexis the concept is the same, it just looks a little different with a couple of different names. The other thing that's different on Lexis, of course, instead of citing references, we could shepherdize, and you'll see that we've got that nice green plus sign, so we know that there are no additional updates we have to worry about. But we can go to shepherdize to see where our section has been mentioned in other sources. So we can see citing decisions or other citing sources. So that's where we'd find our secondary sources, but we would find the decisions here. And the main difference on Lexis, which can sometimes be useful, is we can go to specific subsections of a statute section. There's sometimes, especially if you're in a very complex area like tax, you're really only interested in a subsection of a code section. Being able to look at that subsection for shepherds can be useful. Okay. Any questions or other questions about Lexis? So super quick there, you can actually also get the statutes on Bloomberg. Here is what it looks like. Here's what 4410 looks like on Bloomberg. Again, we've done keyword searching, so I'm not going to make you watch me type yet again. The main difference on Bloomberg, you see the table of contents here on the left to see our statutory scheme. Main difference on Bloomberg, you'd find the information, the credits or history here in this general info. So it gives you the currency, and you'd find the notes of decisions in the smart code, and you'd have to launch that separately. Bloomberg doesn't really have context and analysis, so they're not really Bloomberg doesn't give you references to secondary sources. You just get these basically notes of decisions, case notes. Bloomberg calls it smart code. And we haven't talked much about it yet. We will talk more about fast case when we talk about case finding. Fast case, remember, is that low-cost alternative to Lexis and Westlaw. As members of the New York Bar Association, should you choose to join, you would gain access to the New York portion of fast case for free. Not all of the states, just New York, and I believe the same is true in Louisiana for, I think, the State Bar Association, but possibly also some of the local ones. For Louisiana, not for New York, obviously. But there are statutes here as well. Fast case is a lower cost version, so it does less. It does actually give you case annotations, but that's pretty much it. And as you can see, it's a little bit very difficult to see from the back because it's so small. It's pretty small on my screen too. I can make it bigger. You can search the statutes. Well, as I said, we'll go into more detail on fast case when we talk about cases because it has more interesting things for cases. But you can follow, I think you can pretty easily follow your nose in terms of searching it. Okay, questions? So the last thing I'm going to talk about, and then we will break for a workshop, is just a couple of people asked in the screencast, how do you find statutes when you actually already have this citation? Because it's actually a little tricky for state citations. It's easy for federal because U.S. code, so 29 U.S.C. 1144, and if it's a different code section, it's 29 U.S.C. 201 or whatever it is. That's pretty straightforward, and you've probably seen that enough that you can remember it. Because the states have different formats for their codes, it's, for me anyway, nearly impossible to remember other states. I have a hard enough time remembering New York and all its code names and abbreviations. And on Lexis and Westlaw, they actually abbreviate the different code names differently. So pub-he is how they abbreviate it on Westlaw. I don't even know how they abbreviate it on Lexis. So let's see how to figure that out relatively quickly. Actually, I don't want to shepherdize it. We did that already. Lexis, a lot of people don't realize, have this get a duck up here tucked away in the corner. And then once you know that that's there, then it becomes pretty easy because you can tell it you want statutory codes. I just used this with someone this morning and they loved it for whatever that's worth. And we know we want New York. York, or if you want to go to Louisiana or any other state, and then it gives us the name of the code. So I don't have to figure out or remember that it's pub-he or all of the other dozen or 2 dozen code names. I can just go to whatever code, since I already have this citation I want, and then it should be pretty straightforward. So you click on the code, and then you put in your number, and then you get where you need to go. So we have that on Lexis. We already talked a little bit about shepherdizing. If we were to go to, I'm going to go to 4406 really quickly. So I just wanted to show you the shepherds for 4406, again, because you have that yellow signal of pending legislation, which you would see if you were looking at the regular document. And again, if that were red, you would know that there's an update that you need to check. Okay, so the shortcut on Westlaw, or the trick on Westlaw for getting to statutes, a couple of ways you can go at this. There's actually a really quick shortcut. If you type in the state abbreviation, so NY and then ST, go here to Statute and Court Rules. You can go through the Browse menu to get there as well. And what people may or may not know is available here on that, and this is that same menu we saw when we clicked on McKinney's. So that's another way to get there. And what you see is a find template. And again, you see the code spelled out for us, and you just put in your section here. So if I wanted to find out how to do that for Louisiana, because I am definitely not familiar with Louisiana statutes, and that's not working that way, so okay, so we go through state materials and we go to Louisiana, and then we get to statutes and court rules, and there's Louisiana statutes find template. So here are the different codes with Louisiana. So if I already have a citation, and that's how I would figure out another state. If my quick guess on the state abbreviation didn't work because Westlaw wasn't understanding it, I just browsed through the state. Okay, so that's Lexis. That is Westlaw. For Bloomberg, Bloomberg's a little more difficult. I would just spell it out. So New York Public Health Law 4410. And if you're lucky and you don't have a typo, Bloomberg will recognize it and you can go to the citation. Okay, any questions about getting to statutes, finding statutes, the statutory scheme? That's very important. Again, works pretty much the same with states. Again, that the names and the numbering systems are just a little bit different. Okay, good. Then we are going to go down to the library, another field trip. This time we'll be going to the state materials room. I want to recording. Also wanted to make sure, again, in the screen tests, there were a few questions about still being a little unclear about the public laws. What do they contain? How do you navigate them? Is there any remaining confusion on that? I tried to review that, but if anybody is still confused, okay. So we're going to talk a little bit more about different ways of researching state statutes, and then we'll take a little bit closer look at all kinds of statutes freely available on the web. So very interesting. It is possible at some point you may get asked to look at what different states do on a particular subject. I This happened to me way back while the earth was still cooling and I was practicing, and I had to look at all of the state statutes on underground storage tanks. Lucky me. And I did not take research, so I went and looked at 50 state statutes, one by one, because I did not know that there was something called subject compilation of state laws. And now on Lexis and Westlaw, they are called 50 state statute surveys. So if you wind up with some kind of assignment where you have to find what do these states say on a particular subject, check here first. You may or may not find anything because they're very specific. And the other thing you want to be very aware of on Lexis and Westlaw anyway is that these tend to be the most expensive out-of-plan resources. So if they are not part of your plan wherever you are working, they cost big, big dollars to research. So just make sure with whomever wants you to do this that that's okay. But if it is okay, or if it's included in your plan and you don't have to worry about it, on Lexis, you notice as I type in the words 50 state, I don't even have to get through them, and I get to the Lexis 50 state surveys. And really the biggest challenge about using 50 state surveys is knowing that they exist. So you now have accomplished the biggest challenge because you now know they exist. What do they do exactly? Well, let's take a look. So I can term search them if I want, or I can just browse. Either way. So you might want to term search, since I don't know if what our client would be interested in is under insurance law or healthcare law. Let's take a look at healthcare, and oh, there's managed healthcare. We could take a look. Home healthcare really isn't of interest, so maybe we want to look at healthcare litigation, and it's not quite our topic. So again, you will not find your exact topic all of the time, but if you do, they are really wonderful because, as you can see, you get a nice overview, you get a little bit of explanation about what the area of law is and what states do, and the main reason you go to these is as the name suggests, for all of the states, it gives you the references and links, because we're online, to those state statutes on that particular topic. So for medical malpractice actions, here's Alabama and Arkansas and Arizona, and going down the list. So again, if you get one of these questions, what do the states do on this particular topic? Again, if you have access to it on Lexis or Westlaw, it's definitely great to know about. So that's what it looks like on Lexis. On Westlaw, pretty similar. I actually find, for whatever it's worth, Lexis has a bit broader coverage. So if I have a choice between the two, which we happen to here, I would probably look at Lexis before Westlaw, but Westlaw is good too. So again, 50 state surveys. There's also regulatory. We'll talk about that when we talk about regulations, but here are the statutory ones. And again, the list, you can do a search, you can browse if you prefer. Pretty much the same idea. So I might guess healthcare, I might do a keyword search, either way. And then let's see, within healthcare facilities, corporate practice of medicine might be interesting. And again, the same idea, the listing, a little bit of explanation, and the listing of a state, of the different states' links, as well as you can download the PDF. Now, interestingly, if you have Hein Online available to you wherever you work, or if you can go to your favorite local law library, Hofstra being one, you would be able to access Hein. And as I have been mentioning, Hein has a lot more than just law journals. Law journals are great, don't get me wrong, but Hein has much more. And among that much more are something called subject compilations of state laws. And you have to know to look under subject, which if you don't remember the title, but if you Control F for state laws, you'd find it. If we go to the database, and Hein's looks a little bit different. I actually think in terms of the first place I would go if I need a 50 state survey actually would be Hein if I have it available, which I do and we do. Because it's got the broadest coverage. There is one downside to Hein, which I will show you. And again, you can do a keyword search or you can browse the subjects. And again, I'm clicking on browse to emphasize to you because I know most people just like to go in and keyword search first, but you have to find the right words, and browsing helps you with that. So if we go down to H, it turns out there's a topic for health maintenance organizations. So that turns out to be pretty useful. So HINE is the broadest in terms of giving me the most listings with the most subjects, as you saw. The downside to HINE is that it doesn't always give you the actual state compilation. It just gives you a reference that you then have to find. And the reason for that is what HINE will do is it gives you references not only to what HINE compiles, but to other sources that compile it for you. So here is a Corporate Practice of Medicine 50-state survey published by the American Health Lawyers Association. So there's not a link to it on HINE, but I could see if I could track that down. Maybe it's available for free on the web, I don't know. And here's another example, a 2016 state-by-state guide to managed care. Sometimes HINE will give you a reference to a law journal article that does a 50-state survey, and when that is the case, then HINE, if it's available on HINE, will give you the link. So it will be available to you. So again, HINE has the advantage of being broader and giving you a lot more choice in terms of subjects and availability. It has the disadvantage that you then have to go find the thing. So that is 50-state surveys. Again, hopefully you won't have such a tedious, I found it tedious, I admit, but you won't have a tedious project of finding all 50 states of a fairly arcane and not very exciting subject, but if you do, they do exist. So that's one other aspect of state statute research. Another aspect actually very interestingly came up in a question I think in secondary sources when we were talking about restatements, and a couple of people were interested in how restatements compare to relate to uniform laws. And as I explained at the time, uniform laws are basically created by a couple of different entities, one of which is the Uniform Law Commission, or rather the National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws, which is what that small print says here. And basically this commission of experts sit down and think about what would be the ideal statutory scheme, set of laws, set of sections for a particular area of law. So by particular area, we can look here at this listing of existing acts. What would be the ideal laws for states to have about adoption? Because you think about adoption has interstate ramifications, right? As people move from one state to the other, if they want to adopt. Here's on Anatomical Gift Act. So various areas. Some of the areas you've all probably already encountered, the Uniform Commercial Code, right? I'm sure you've discussed that way back in contracts, if not in other classes since. Now, interestingly, another one you've all talked about is the Model Penal Code back in crim law, and again, possibly since then. The Model Penal Code is actually put together by the other organization, the American Law Institute, ALI, which turns out is the same organization that also creates the restatements. So model laws and restatements do two different things. Restatements, that experts sit down, as we already talked about, and put together what the law is in that black letter format, and then they have their comments. So it's cases, restatements are considered very persuasive because they're prepared by these experts. Model laws, like the model penal codes or uniform laws, are basically aspirational. They aren't the law as it exists. They're aspirations. Hey, states, we think this is the best way to structure your penal code, or we think this is the best way to structure your commercial code, and here's what we suggest you adopt. And then what happens is the states will or will not adopt them as they see fit, and sometimes even if they do adopt them, might change them some to fit that state's priorities. So if we wanted to take a look at any of these acts, I'm just going to pick one on this page because it's easy, the Business Organizations Code. So it looks like there's one whole state that has adopted the recommended Business Organizations Code, and that state is Idaho, and I know that by looking at this map because it's this enacted color. Let's see if we can find an act. I happen to know the Partnership Act. Let's see if we can find it quickly for you. Partnership Act. So here's the Partnership Act. A lot more states have adopted the recommended Partnership Act recommended by the Uniform Law Commission. New York hasn't, but basically the western half of the country has, as we can see from the map. And so those states basically enacted, they put it into their codes. Again, they might change them, you know, parts. They might make major changes, they may make minor or no changes, and you know by going to that particular state's code and how they adopt it. The way you would find these uniform, so you'd either find the state's enactment of the particular uniform law or model penal code in the state's code, or you can find the uniform law as it was proposed by the Uniform Law Commission here at the website. Here, Uniform Law Commission, easy enough to find via Google, or back in the old days again, before we had all this stuff on the web, and if you still needed to find it in print, there's this set called the Uniform Laws Annotated. It exists in print. It's actually also on Westlaw because the print is published by West. So if for whatever reason you wanted to find it in print, send this around if you're interested. Not, that's okay too. But occasionally you might find reason to need to know that whatever code section you're looking at for your particular state, turns out it's part of this larger uniform law, and it might, understanding that might give you a better sense of the law, where it came from.
This tells you changes. I think telling you.
Yeah.
Right. It tells you the changes that in adopting it, Montana substituted the word, I don't know, blank for blank.
Yeah. So actually, that's one advantage of the uniform laws annotated. Again, annotated anything is usually your friend. So those annotations give you those greater explanations. Other questions, comments, observations? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about finding statutes overall on the web. We already started to talk about that in terms of where to find New York statutes for free. But I also, since we didn't mention it last week, I want to make sure to also talk about where to find federal statutes. So there are several different places to find the U.S. Code for free online. I'm not going to mention all of them because I don't think it's necessary, but the two places I would recommend, GovInfo, is the new version of the government's publication site. And this is where you would find the U.S. Code. Basically, we saw the U.S. Code last week as it is officially printed. Remember, it comes out every 6 years, and the supplement comes out to update it, but they're a couple of years behind. This is essentially the online version of that, so it also is not particularly up to date. So we find the 2016 version, and you can find it, as you see, in PDF if that's what you need. The U.S. Code has been redesigned to make it more general public friendly, so you can, if you start from there, main home page, you can search. So this is one place to find the official U.S. code, but find it online in PDF. If I'm actually doing research, however, and I need to research the U.S. code, I want to see what the law is today from a federal standpoint, I'm going to come here to the House of Representatives site. And again, if you Google House of Representatives U.S. code, it hopefully will bring you here. This might look hopefully familiar to a few of you who recognize this layout, because this is where we find that Table 3 tool. Remember the translation table between public laws and the U.S. code. It's also where we find the popular name tool that we used last time. So this site is also where we would find the text of the U.S. code, but updated. So as you can see, you can jump to a title and section, and what I particularly like about this particular site, because you know how important I think updating is we've got a whole section on currency and updating, and it tells us right up top, online code is current through Public Law 131/2018, so it's pretty up to date. And it allows us to search. We could do a simple search. There's an advanced search. If we want to search in particular titles. And we have search tips, and we talked a little bit about, and we will do so throughout the semester when we're encountering a new site, whether it's a database, whether it costs money or not, how to figure out how to use it. And one of the main ways is to see where you can find help or search tips. So if I want to get a sense of how to search this, does it take Boolean connectors? Does it allow me to do natural language? These search tips will hopefully let me know. I think the answer for this particular site is you can't use natural language, but obviously it lets you do Booleans and search connectors. But notice it's got some funky ones, like ADJ and before. Or again, you can just try a simple search. So that is the U.S. code on the web. Kind of already looked at New York. So again, if you were to Google New York Code, New York Statutes, hopefully this would come up pretty close to the top. And you can see some of the code names that we now are sort of getting to know a little bit better. And it tells us again, always a way I judge a site, it tells me how updated it is. So as of February 1st, this is updated through Chapter 1 of 2018. And we now know chapter is just the name for session law in New York. If we wanted to say, all right, well, it's up to Chapter 1, what about Chapters 2 through however many there are? This site's a little funky. You have to know to look at lists, which you might or might not do, and then go to chapters. And for some reason, when I go that way, you have to kind of reload it a couple of times to get it to list. And this is the beauty of being on the web. You discovered some of the disadvantages of using the books. Well, sometimes the web doesn't load particularly correctly, because if you try it enough times, you wind up getting this. And again, I don't actually know why that's coming up. But it turns out this chapter list, there is only Chapter 1. So I know that our website is as up to date as it can be. Now, if for whatever reason you are Googling New York statutes or Louisiana statutes or any other state statutes and you're just not finding it, this is where knowing a couple of good legal portals can be useful. I happen to like the Legal Information Institute. Another one is FindLaw, whatever works for you. And I use these for if I want to get to a particular state's primary law sources, and I'm either Googling isn't working or I'm too lazy to Google and I'm already here. So you can see the list of states. I got this list here, Get the Law, so I could get to the U.S. code. I could get to law by jurisdiction and go to state laws. Actually, one reason, law by jurisdiction, and if I go over slowly, I can go to state law, which is the list we're looking at, and actually find uniform laws, what we were just looking at, as well as federal law. So just by way of comparison, so here would be that link to the site we were just looking at, and here are other New York primary sources as well. So out of curiosity, bless you, let's take a quick look at Louisiana, since Alex is interested in that. So Louisiana laws. So this is what the Louisiana laws looks like online, a lot different than New York.
It's a very searchable interface too.
There you go. You have more expertise in that than I, since I haven't searched Louisiana laws. So New York isn't bad. Pardon me?
Don't.
Just don't. Okay. Fair enough. So that is state codes online for free. It's a whole lot better than it used to be. Any questions? All right. We are now officially through the segment on statutes. So a little bit of review before I distribute the assignment. Back to our sources, way back to the beginning where we started. Understanding the difference between a session law and a code. I've mentioned it a couple of times. Hopefully this handout helps you. If not, and you're still confused, speak up now, come ask me later. Again, session law originally passed by the legislature, signed by the executive, and then it gets codified into the code. That session law is known as public law in the federal world. It's known as chapter law in New York. It's known as an act in other states like Louisiana and Connecticut. And then when it gets codified, it goes into the various versions of the code. As we just saw online, they can look a little bit different amongst the states. Of course, the U.S. code for federal. Okay, we talked about how to go back and forth because, and this actually was an area, I wonder if the screencast was a little bit unclear because quite a few people were a little bit confused about the public law section number always being the same in the U.S. code, which is rarely the case. So in other words, if the section in the public law 93406 is section 2, it's not going to be section 2 in the U.S. code. So remember our section, we were interested in section 514 in 93406. Section 514 is the preemption section, and it turns out it's 1144 in the U.S. code. So the numbers are totally different, and there's no really rhyme or reason. So if you want, when you need to translate, because remember a lot of newspaper articles, some cases, other legal materials will refer to the public law section. If you need to figure out where in the U.S. code so you can read that section as it exists today, you might want to use our translation table, otherwise known as Table 3 or the Table 3 tool. And remember, once we had that public law number with the year, we went through our Table 3 tool, So once we knew our year, 1974, and we knew our public law number, 93406, we could see the translation. If we were only given the popular name, we start at the popular name. You start with whatever tool has the information you have. So if you have the public law, you start with the Table 3 tool. If you have the popular name, you start with the popular name table. And scroll down to whatever information you have. So if it's the Civil Rights Act, if it's ERISA, employee retirement, scroll down and you can get the public law and then get the U.S. code section that way. So again, understand the mechanics, but more importantly, understand the concept of the public law sections getting transferred over and put into a statutory scheme, put into a subject arrangement in the U.S. code. Same thing on state. Starts off as session laws. So starts off in McKinney's session laws, which I passed around over here in the various chapters. Each chapter, those sections get divided up and put into McKinney's code, into the black version, as we say on the sources handout, into the various subject areas, public health, general municipal, general obligations, whatever other that are racing and municipal, whatever that was. So again, starts as a chapter. Those sections in the chapter are going to be totally different section numbers in the appropriate subject code or title. Okay, finding statutes, very important. As we've discussed several times, start with secondary sources. However, secondary sources will not necessarily give you every piece of the puzzle that you need. You always want to search in the code in addition to secondary sources. Start in secondary sources because they will help explain. We wouldn't have known about preemption or ERISA without starting in secondary sources, but we still, once we get a background in preemption or ERISA, we still also want to search the code. We want to search the federal code, and in our case, because it could be both state and federal, we want to search the state code as well. Don't forget to use the table of contents. Again, showing that statutory scheme. A lot of times with keyword searching, because you're searching the code, just as I'm saying you must do, because the terminology is so specialized, that controlled vocabulary, you may get close. You may get into the right title. Remember, title is just a subject area, so you may get into public health in the New York Code, or you may get into Title 29, the Labor Code in the U.S. Code, but you may not have the right section number. If you look at the table of contents, the statutory scheme, you might say, oh, the section I got isn't great, but oh, wait, 3 up, that's the perfect one, hooray. And I say that because it's happened to me, where a lot of times the section number I'm getting isn't so great. Or even if I look in the printed, this section number isn't so great, but I look in the table of contents and realize, all right, that's just right next to, because they're related, that's right next to or near the section that is really the relevant one that I need. So table of contents, super, super useful to put you in that statutory scheme. The other thing you need to watch out for, and this is a hint for your upcoming assignment, as you do the research for the problem in the assignment, be very aware of that statutory scheme, because your search terms, which are perfectly good search terms, can put you in a totally different subject area that isn't relevant to the problem at hand. They have your search terms, and a lot of people, oh, it's got my search terms, that's my section, without thinking about what section of the code, which turns out to be not at all relevant to the question at hand. That's the danger of online searching, keyword searching. So be very aware of that statutory scheme. Okay, annotated code is your friend, another theme for the last couple of weeks. In addition to giving you the text of the section, which of course you must read, it gives you all those other research aids, the secondary sources to help explain. Of course, those notes of decisions and citing references, slightly different, but all both very useful. The annotated code is going to give you the updating information, whether you have to slog through the print pocket part and update to the update, as I like to say, or you can look online and just make sure you're aware that you're looking to see if there's any red flag or red indicator telling you that there are updates to your section that have been adopted. Any questions? So I've just done the past 2 weeks' lectures in about 5 minutes. Okay, a couple of things to remember about statutes I haven't really mentioned and probably already know. So the section we've been looking at, the U.S. Code Annotated, 1144 talks about preemption with regard to ERISA. Turns out preemption is actually a concept within statutes that can apply in other areas as well, where tends to be a federal law preempts a state law. So one of the questions that exists now as states start to legalize marijuana, either for medical purposes or for recreational purposes, do the federal laws regarding marijuana marijuana preempt the state laws? And that's an important question as businesses start to crop up, especially in California, since it's now legal for recreational use. And how do the federal and state laws interact, or in this case, possibly conflict? So preemption is more than just an ERISA question for a hypothetical in this class. Preemption is something you want to think about generally. Pretty obvious, but best to state it anyway. Unlike cases, which if you look in a different jurisdiction might be persuasive to a court. So if you're in New York, you might say, hey, look what they're doing in New Jersey in a case, and the court doesn't have to follow it, as you know, but they might say, oh, that makes sense. Not so with statutes. Basically, what's in New York stays in New York. So New York statutes really have no bearing on what goes on in New Jersey, California, Louisiana, or anywhere else. If you want to think about it, you imagine a court in Louisiana looking at a New York statute, not wanting to pay any attention to what those obnoxious New Yorkers are saying.
You look at Jersey to find out what's unethical, though.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, but that's cases.
Well, yeah, but I mean, in laws as well. I mean, I think
they might look to get ideas, but in terms of what's authority, and it's true for cases too. Well, again, case law, but New York corporate law is going to be what's applied to corporations incorporated in New York. A lot of corporations incorporate in Delaware because it's favorable for them, but so that's again which is the authoritative law. Again, the point being that when you're doing statutory research, looking at another state's statutes isn't nearly as useful as if you're doing case law research. And again, we'll go into more detail on case law research in a few weeks. If you know you're working with a statutory issue, either you have some background or you come across it in your secondary research pretty quickly, then I would recommend that at least after your secondary research, statutes is the first place you look at rather than cases. Lawyers, especially new ones, and law students especially, you've been talking about cases most of the time for the last 2 or 3 years. You want to go look at cases. But if your area is statutorily based, then really it makes more sense to start with the statutes. I'm not saying don't look at cases, by no means, but the statute is what the law is based on, so try not to always look at cases first. Think about what kind of issue is this. And you may not know yet. We didn't know yet when we started investigating HMOs and liability. We learned pretty quickly. So I would say with an issue like ours, after investigating all the secondary resources that seem useful, as we talked about, the next place I would look at would be to look at the statute. We will get to cases, definitely very important, but not where I would start. Any questions? Alrighty then. So here is assignment number 2. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. As I said, I will be looking at your assignment 1s and getting them back to you next week, well before the due date of this, which is 2 weeks from today. So you will have an opportunity to look at my comments and incorporate them if need be in your assignment 2. You'll see the instructions on top are the same. So what you'll be doing, we're using the same problem with regard to advertising NT. And the first thing I will ask you, I'll wait for it to go around. This is also up on the website. Should be, anyway. Or will be shortly. I told Westlaw to post it at 6 o'clock, but Westlaw isn't posting it at 6 o'clock. It'll be up there. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is look back to your assignment 1 and to list whatever statutes you found. And let me know which secondary source you found those statutes for both federal and state. If you didn't find any in any of your secondary sources, then state that. Then I'm going to ask you for part 2 to look at New York statutory codes. I'm asking you to look at all 3 services just to get some experience with them, Bloomberg, Lexis, and Westlaw. Not going to read through every single question, but again, if you have confusion about what I'm asking you, let me know. The one thing I will highlight again, just because it's a new term I introduced today in question 3C, under what statutory scheme does your section fall? So I'm going to give you the answer for what we were looking at today. So here, for instance, on Westlaw, here's the statutory scheme for the federal statute, 29 U.S.C.A. 1144. The answer would be Title 29 Labor, Chapter 18 Employee Retirement Income Security Program. The answer for, whoops, I didn't mean to click on that entirely. The answer for New York, since this is a New York question, again, would be the public health law, and it would be the Article 44 health maintenance organizations. So you will be looking at a different New York statute section. That's what a statutory scheme is. Again, I'm going to ask you to look at the table of contents. Look on Westlaw for the index. Again, to get to the index on Westlaw, click on the top link for bikinis, and you'll see it along the side. Okay, on question number 9, again, just to be as clear as I possibly can. So I'm asking you for your best section. So if you determined, and obviously this is a totally different subject, but if you were looking at section 4406, how is it treated by key site or shepherds? And again, for questions, I'll finish this thought first. So how is it treated? So here, basically, again, this is very straightforward, very important, but very easy. So that's take it when you get it, right? It's something very easy. All you can say is, on Westlaw, it's up to date with only proposed legislation. Now, your particular section, if you do see a red signal, you'll want to pretty much let me know what it says the update is. Unusual, because Westlaw and Lexis are pretty good about incorporating any updates pretty quickly, but again, easy, but you need to check. Okay, and note also for questions 7 through 9, you're only using either Lexis or Westlaw, and just let me know which one. So for 1 through 6, it's all 3. For 7 through 9, it's just one of them, and for 10, it's just a comparison. And those are the things I just wanted to make sure were as clear as possible. If you have other questions either now or in future, don't hesitate, let me know. If they are questions of general interest, I will post them here. I'll email everybody through Twen so everybody knows the same answer, but I'll also post them here so you can refer back. I know stuff does get lost in emails now and again. Any questions? Alrighty, we're done a little bit early, so let's enjoy a little extra of the evening, and I will see you all next